A very good morning. Welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with Lookuptv. The hashtag is The Morning Drift. Nasila Lima here. And right about now, I'll be bringing you our morning conversation here on the program. And our focus is on ending violence against women. The 16 days of activism against GBV. And now joining me on set is Faith Opio, who is a gender specialist at AMREF. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine, thank you. You look amazing.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here.
Most welcome. You didn't deal with traffic, did you?
Well, given the timing, then we can't evade traffic, but we are here. Thank you.
Okay, and let's dive straight into our conversation. 16 days of activism. So gender-based violence. Where are we so far with addressing the issue?
First, as I said again, thank you for having me on the show. And this is a very timely conversation, and not just timely, but very important conversation that we should have as a country and even within media stations. So 16 days of activism, just to let people know, because it's also an opportunity for raising awareness on what is happening around gender-based violence areas and even what needs to be done. So it is an annual momentum and initiative that it's a global momentum and initiative that countries and globally it's celebrated to end gender-based violence against women and girls. So it starts on 25th of November, which is the International Day of Ending Violence Against Women and Girls, and ends on 10th of December, which is the Human Rights Day. So within these 16 days, countries, organizations use these to amplify voices of survivors, voices of victims, voices of initiatives that are ending GBV and any form of violence. Of course, majority of it is against women and girls, and This is driven by data. So if I can talk about data a little bit, is that
just before that, then when we're talking about gender-based violence, what comes in the top of the head is then physical abuse and sexual abuse. Is it beyond physical and sexual abuse?
It is beyond. Right now we are also having emerging trends amongst men and boys, and majority of them experience the other form of violence that is not normally talked about, which is emotional violence. We have financial violence. So it has different categories of violence, and most of it we talk about women being affected most because of the data that I wanted to talk about, and also the fact that women and girls tend to report more vis-a-vis the boys and the men. So it's not just about sexual and physical. There's the emotional aspect of it. There's also the financial aspect of it.
Right.
Yes.
Now let's talk about the numbers for, say, the last 1 year. What are the number of cases that have been reported, and which specifically are the cases?
I will start with the global, the global picture. It still remains that 1 out of every 3 girls has or will experience a form of violence, the 4 that we've talked about, in their lifetime. Meaning, Nerima, if we were me, you, and another lady here, one of us has a story of gender-based violence. 40% of these women, only less than 40% of these women report the cases. Where are the 60? So the numbers are still low. More than 5 women and girls have the tendency of being battered and even being killed with a family member. So these numbers are really out there globally, and are the ones that drives intervention. When you come back to the country, when we were launching the 16 days of activism in Kilifi, which is also one of the counties that have high rates of incidences of gender-based violence and teenage pregnancies, and other counties that also have incidences of female genital mutilation. We can't put a particular number, but we have women and girls being at risk, one, and having the bigger, percentage in terms of being violated. So we still stick with the global 1 out of every 3 women and girls have gone through or are capable of going through gender-based violence in their lifetime.
Right, and now that these numbers are alarming and more cases are not even being reported, because you said about 60% go unreported. So then what could be the hurdle right there where these cases are not being reported?
One, it's the structure. There's one thing to report, and then there's another thing of will the case be followed through? Because there's also referral mechanism whenever gender-based violence happen. If at all it was something like sexual gender-based violence, we know you have to go to the hospital, you have to report the police station. After that, now through the P3 and even the documentation that you've received, now we can start the legislative process. But then we have hurdles and bottlenecks, even at the legislative process, that's supposed to bring the perpetrators to books, just the way we had said. So this is one of the things why people don't want to report, because one, you can report, but then what next? What will happen to the perpetrator? But you, as the survivor, you're going to be reintegrated back to the community. So there's depending on also the nature of the violence, there's a community who are going to shut you down for reporting, for even speaking up. Number two, most of these cases are from the people we know, either family members or relatives or neighbors, people you know. So you feel victimized and you feel that you are not capable to report because these are people you know, and sometimes, quote unquote, you feel so sorry for them, or you feel
because then they're your family members.
They are your family members, so why should you report them? So these are some of the reasons also. Some are also engraved in cultural beliefs, in that if it's a family member, like the case we had also in Kilifi, they will say these things that happen within family, we can just slaughter a goat, make some chants and invite ancestors, and the blood will take away all these things, especially for incest cases.
Right.
So some of these things are also engraved in cultural and, you know, these social beliefs with the culture.
Right. And stigma has also been one of the reasons that have been reported before, so that people don't want to be labeled. So is that also a challenge that you have encountered in just trying to address the GBV?
Yeah, it is. And one thing that you need to understand is that violence done to you as an individual, number one, it's not something that you, as much as we say that people should talk about it, it's not something that you want to be very bold out there and proclaim it. First, there is the feeling of, I'm not worthy. You start blaming yourself. You feel unclean, for example, especially if it was for sexual violence. There's a lot of blame game. So you first have the self, you know, you stigmatize yourself before even the society, you know, merit that stigma on you. So it is a thing, and what we need to do, especially within these 16 days of awareness, is to tell survivors that it's not your fault. The problem is not with you. The problem is the perpetrator. It is not probably what you were putting on. It is not how you talked. It is not the tone of your voice that, you know, invited that form of gender-based violence. It's not about you. So we try to ensure that survivors are not stigmatizing themselves before society also merits that. So yes, it is a thing. Stigma also plays.
And according to the numbers, there are even more cases that have been reported for violence that has been meted against children who are between 0 to 7 years.
The last, like the case that we had that was reported, the youngest was a 3-day-old child, and the oldest was 102 years. So gender-based violence doesn't have an age in the face of a perpetrator, in short. So if you can sexually abuse a 3-day-old child, then where are we heading at? Where are we heading as a country? So yes, the numbers are there, and GBV doesn't have a face. What we know is that most of the time it is the face of a woman and the face of a child, because the society deems them as weak, gullible, and they cannot... Vulnerable, and they cannot also talk on their behalf, given the fact that also women do not control factors of production that can help them in terms of reporting, accessing legal fees, accessing all these things that needs finances. So the numbers are drifting, you know, towards women and children. Yes.
Right. And just looking at the numbers as well, COVID-19 definitely exposed a lot of these underlying conditions, and as well just communities, female genital mutilation, then even in some communities that had stopped these long periods of children staying at home, then some of these, they cropped up back in. So in trying to address GBV in those specific areas, has COVID-19 then set those efforts back?
COVID-19 did set it back, but also, as you've said, it exposed some of the weaknesses we had in terms of policy, in terms of implementation. And I remember the conversation that now was happening globally is that countries need to find policy framework and legislative framework of integrating emergency response, GBV emergency response, towards their, policies, whether it's at the national level or even at the county level. And I remember organizations even rallying up in terms of any intervention that they were giving towards the pandemic. They had to incorporate GBV aspect, whether it's in terms of trauma counseling or issuing dignity kits that have sanitary towels, that have lessons to, cover up. So to just give you that dignity also. So yes, it set us back, but then it also gave us an opportunity to ask ourselves, what more can we do in terms of pandemic? It can be COVID today, but tomorrow we don't know what else will happen.
Right.
So how prepared are we in terms of dealing with these, emergency responses and integrating GBV into this work? So it set us back, but it also gave us an opportunity to continue the narrative, to change the narrative, and even to add more in terms of interventions. Yeah.
Right. And what do the numbers look like for the men who have been violated?
As I said, data is still gray, especially with men. No wonder we keep on harming that it's women and girls. Majority of men don't report gender-based violence cases. And of course, it's because of socialization that they have had. You will be deemed weak if you report. You will be deemed, they will tell you you're behaving like a woman if you report. You are supposed to be strong even if these things happen. So the number tends to lie around consequences in terms of mental health towards men vis-a-vis them reporting that, hey, I was beaten yesterday. Hey, I was sodomized. And sodomy cases are also very high right now. And I give an example also in Kilifi. I'm referring to Kilifi because this is where we launched our 16 days of activism,
right.
2022. There were a number of cases, even in terms of sodomy, but they were not being reported. You hear them from the community, but are they in books? Are they being documented? And this data is what we need to, one, do proper intervention tailor-made for boys and girls. If you don't have data, then it's just said. One thing that we normally say in NGO world, if it's not documented, it never happened. So majority of the things that there's no evidence, and majority of the cases that are being documented are the ones being reported by women and girls. Yeah.
So in those communities, and especially in communities where women's rights have been curtailed over the years, then what is the message out there that you take, and how can people just possibly step out and say, I have been violated?
That's a good question. And it draws me back to when we were also starting the 16 days of activism, the COOPA, with the Parliamentary Organization of Women.
Right.
One thing that was coming out is when women who are powerful holding this position came out and started saying, I have also gone through this. I've also gone through this. And they are in power. They have the financial might, they have the knowledge, they have the awareness. Right. So the message that constantly needs to be passed through is by, I feel, is by the people who are already in power and who can be able to speak and say, look, I'm all this flashy, I'm all this beautiful, but I've also gone through this, and this is how we can merge together and, we can merge together and deal with GBV cases. So the message in community is that they know probably gender-based violence is for the chosen few who are poor, who don't know how to fight for themselves.
Right.
But you see, it doesn't have a face. That's just the way we were saying, it doesn't have an age. It can happen to anybody. It can happen to me and you. But then we need to give safe space where if Nerima is violated, she can be able to speak up.
So then that goes back now to communities.
Yes.
Giving the enabling environment for people to be able to speak out.
Yes.
Right.
And not just environment, but once they speak up, can it be followed through to ensure that all the processes from coming out and speaking up can be able to followed and can be able to be followed up until justice is, they get justice, the perpetrators are given the rightful places, and the survivors have also now feel free to be integrated back to the community. And this one also brings me back to the intervention. It's just not a matter of speaking up. Can we follow up even with counseling? Because most of these things, they're very traumatic. I remember one singer here, she came out, and by the time she was speaking up that the uncle had abused her, this was like 26, 25 years later, and she remembers what happened to her those many years back.
Right.
And when she was talking about it, she even cried. It's something like happened a moment ago. So trauma is real, and it can follow through 30, 40 years. So if it has not been handled, then when you're speaking up, then it gets to also follow you up through. Right. So speak up, but then let us also have ways of, following it through.
Okay. And so there are many stakeholders. So say when a victim who has been abused, then they would need the psychosocial help, they need health services, they need the legal services, probably economic support. So, and you see, these are all different stakeholders. So is it that the stakeholders are not in tune, such that now the victims, they go unresolved?
Not that they're not in tune. I feel different stakeholders focus on their own strengths, on different strengths. There are those stakeholders who are going to focus on legal services because that is what they do, whether it's pro bono services or it's you have to pay for it. There are those stakeholders who will just be like, our intervention is around health and psychosocial support. There are those stakeholders who will be like us, we are able to probably build safe centers. After you've received all these things, we can give you accommodation before or rather during the process where your case is in court and stuff like that. So they're in tune, but I feel people focus on different things. What we need to have is a strong coordinating element where these things tend to, complement each other. But when you're talking about coordinating, we have to have a coordinating body. These stakeholders, some of them are in government, some of them are not in government. We have both state and non-state actors. What is the common coordinating mechanism that can bring them together? So I feel that is what we've been lacking.
Okay.
Not just lacking, it needs to be strengthened because there are already organizations that are already having that coordinating element and trying to bring on board county government, national government, and even other state and non-state actors around GBV space to just rally more effort and amplify majority of these voices. But more needs to be done, especially right now when we are talking about amplifying. And there are also emerging trends right now when we're talking about physical abuse or sexual abuse that is well known. There's an emerging trend on digital gender-based violence, which people don't seem to talk about, but majority of people right now are geared towards, digital gender-based violence.
Right.
Yeah.
And we'll be talking about those trends. But there is an issue that I came across, the intimate partner violence, which are also they're rarely reported.
Yes.
And so people who are in committed relationships, in marriages, there is gender-based violence that happens even within such structures, but ideally people don't see it as that.
Yeah. We call it IPV, with the intimate partner violence. It is also the most common one and unfortunately
Right.
not also reported. Within the setup, we can talk about domestic issues, right? Domestic issues around emotional, around physical, around sexual. And sexual is very hard amongst couple because sexual gender-based violence, for you to say you've been raped probably by your partner, there is the aspect of consent. When you are legally married, there are also things that I feel tend to define consent because
Right.
also community says, when he wants, you are married. So how do you prove that you are raped within the marital, the marital bed where you're supposed, it's consensual. They assume it's consensual. So it's hard to prove that probably your partner raped you. They will assume if you're married, you're supposed to give in. Again, there are structures that continue to catalyze all these things. Religion is one of them, and I'm a religious person. So when every now and then you're being told aspects of, submission, if your partner wants conjugal rights, you're supposed to be giving him. Your body is not your own. Your body is your husband's body. Your husband's body is...
You become one.
You become one. So when such institutions, or rather such ideas are kept on, you are told this and this every now and then, it gets in your head. So reporting it becomes hard because my body is not my body is my husband's body. So it's hard to report. Domestic issues around physical violence, abuse, the worst is even emotional because you don't have evidence that I'm emotionally abused unless it's via chats, somebody is abusing you, is all
Right.
these statements that they're saying. But emotional abuse that is not also talked about is very hard to prove. So if you're going to follow it up, again, in terms of evidence, what proof do you have? That one, you were raped within the marital status. Two, that you were emotionally abused. Three, that you are financially deprived even within, this partnership.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, looking at those numbers as well, then for the intimate partner violence, what do the numbers look like?
I won't be so sure about the numbers around IPV, but what I know is that they are the most reported cases. And also this one varies within the counties because, as I said, we have the Kenya Demographic Health Survey that also reports cases around sexual gender-based violence. So within every county, they have their own, reporting mechanism. So nationally, I won't really know the number, but within the counties, that is reported.
Right.
Yeah.
So of course, the majority of the cases are the ones that are not reported.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And then I wanted to talk about the emerging trends, but we do have to take a very short break here on the program. Our conversation centered around ending violence against women and girls. Remember, this is within the 16 days of activism against GBV. Don't go too far.
Hapa kazi tu inaendelea kuwasaka na kuwatambua wale ambao wanafanya kazi extraordinary na zile kazi za kujituma.
Biashara yote unaambiangwa, as long as you have a plan, you can do it. Our service is about to the customer.
Mpenzi mtazamaji, hii ni hapa kazi tu.
Good to have you join us on Heart to Heart.
We bring you stories of people who, despite the pressures they experienced, still trusted God to see them through.
The seeds that was sown in me helped me navigate and overcome that period of my life.
New testimonies, new insights, and even better revelation of the good things God has in store for us.
There is always a blessing waiting for someone in every episode.
wakati wa mkutano. Jioni kwenye kamati ya kijiji.
Hadithi hii ilianza mwaka 1991.
Vipi kuhusu ngano kwenye shamba langu kauka? Haina haja. Tutakupa kwa njia pia tukapuje.
Mkoa unaojiendesha wa Ningxia ulitekeleza sera ya makazi mapya ya kuhamisha watu wa maeneo yenye umaskini ya Xiaigu ili waweze kujikimu.
Ninatumaini sana kwamba siku moja jangwa hapa litakuwa kijani kibichi na mji wetu wa Mining utakuwa na miundombinu kamili.
Vera Beauty and Fashion College is focused on being the leading technical and vocational training institute in the region. Our team possesses in-depth knowledge and extensive experience in the industry, offering thorough training in cosmetology, hairdressing, interior design, creative arts, training of trainers, nail technology, and fashion design. With branches in Nairobi, Thika, Meru, Eldoret, and now in Mombasa, our courses ensure that learners are completely equipped with knowledge, competency, and employability skills. Enroll today to be a part of a center of excellence.
Welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with Lookuptv. The hashtag is The Morning Drift. Nancy Nalima here, and you can catch this live conversation across all our social media platforms. That's Lookuptv on Twitter, Lookuptv on Facebook, and Lookuptv on our official YouTube channel. With me right here on set is Faith Opio, who is a gender specialist at AMREF. And Faith, let's continue the conversation. And let's talk about female genital mutilation, which is a form of violence meted against young girls. And there are specific communities that the cases of FGM are more, the cases that have been reported. So where would you say we are as a country with the efforts of ending female genital mutilation?
In 2019, one thing also that I also like to say is that with the efforts of eliminating gender-based violence against women and girls, is that we have the highest political commitment and political will, right from the former president to the current president. And it was just 2 days ago, actually yesterday, that the president said that his government will not tolerate any cases of FGM. And it's the same tone, the same energy that also the previous government had. In 2019, when the president declared that, issued a declaration that FGM should not be heard of. And we, as a country, we should end FGM by this year, 2022, actually, just a few days, to the end of the year.
Right.
So where we are at is that efforts have been made. We've seen communities embracing it because FGM is engraved on patriarchal, patriarchal systems and patriarchal beliefs. We've seen men coming out, we've seen elders coming out within the 22 hotspot counties of FGM that have already been put. They're coming out and they're saying that, well, we are looking at alternative methods of the rite of passage because they took it as a rite of passage. So what other way can show that a 10-year-old girl is transitioning to puberty instead of having the cut? So I feel as a country we've had good policies. The FGM Act of 2011 has been put into place. We've had communities implementing this act. We've had good political will at the national level and even at the county level. So yes, the efforts are there. We haven't yet ended FGM, but we are making the steps.
Right.
Now, apart from the 2022 declaration, there are also global initiatives that Kenya is a part of. One of it is Generation Equality Forum that wants to end elimination of GBV by 2026. Another one is the global one, the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030 that also highlight ending gender-based violence by 2030. So we may not have ended FGM in the next, we will not have ended FGM in the next few weeks. That's supposed to be ending this year. But then we still have a window period and an opportunity to have 2026 that Kenya is part of, Generation Equality Forum, as I said, and Agenda 2030, which is the SDG, which we're also part of. So steps are being made, not just globally, but even nationally, through political will, through CSOs that have also rallied to give government sort of a buffer in terms of funding, in terms of implementation, and even holding them accountable to what they say that we should be ending this vice.
Right. So then the voice of the president, very important on such a pertinent issue.
Extremely, because before declaration in 2019, you could get chiefs who are actually participating in FGM. They would be brought for cases, but they will not take the cases forward. In fact, they will be, applauding such efforts. But once the declaration had been made by the highest office, then they had to be very intentional in terms of ending it, because the president has said. So the voice is very powerful to amplify and even catalyze some of these elimination.
Right, and there are critics who've argued then that the sentencing of the FGM perpetrators is very little. What are your thoughts?
I don't know law a lot, but all these are engraved around our legal framework and our legal documents, with the further being Constitution. We have the Penal Code, we have the Sexual Offences Act that gives, minimum and the maximum terms of service. So because I don't have that background, right, I will still stick to the Penal Code, I will still stick to the Sexual Offences Act that gives you, the term that you cannot say that this one is little, this one is a lot. So whenever judgment is being given, it has to fall, they have to consider the legislative framework that is already there, the legal framework that is already there. Yes.
Right. And now let's talk about the other forms of violence. We've given the different categories, and more so the emotional abuse, which is not only at home, it could also be in the workplace. And then the workplace has recently been named a very toxic place for very many people. So let's talk about how then this emotional violence happens even in the work setting.
It's unfortunate that most of the time we were saying that these things happen at home, but as you've rightfully put it, the workplace is becoming toxic day by day. And it's because of, one, as I said, some of these things have to have the policy and the legal framework.
Right.
We have International Labour Organization Convention 190, we call it ILOC 190, that talks about having policies in workplace to end sexual harassment, even at work, and gender-based violence at work. There are some nations that have ratified the ILOC 190. Kenya, we're in the process of starting the conversation of ratification. But even if we haven't ratified the ILO 190, we have the Employment Act that also covers workers within the market space. Private sector also came in place because they're also sort of 50-50 in terms of employment. Government, of course, has a high employees. Right. Private sector also have. They launched their gender mainstreaming policy that also brings out issues around harassment at workplace, issues around GBV at workplace. And these, I find this to be very intentional, not just private or public sector, but people are having this conversation. It is very draining when you come at work and you're being abused by colleagues horizontally and vertically. Right. But if you have policies in place, if we leave alone the private sector or even the national, even within, if I say Lookuptv, do they have somewhere where workers sign that if this was to happen, these are the reporting mechanism, or this will be done to so and so who perpetrates, not just physically but emotionally. Organizations need to have that. Where I work, we have that. So it's
more upon even the employer just to ensure that the environment is right.
Exactly. And even the employer may not have that vision, but employees need to understand that their mental health, their health generally is very important. And if they don't push for this thing, then employers will not move with it. So it's also upon individual. And just like we normally say, with the fight against GBV, you need to personalize it. If you don't personalize it, then we will not get far in terms of fighting. So personalization means myself. I don't have to wait for somebody else to bring it up when I'm signing the contract. Where is my safety at work? If this happens, what do I need to do? So if I start having the conversation with my employer, I don't need to have a colleague who is doing it. Then the conversation keeps going. Right. So we don't have to wait for it to be globally, nationally, and cascaded to organization, but people need to be very intentional. Even at workplace.
And that conversation at workplace, and workplace is very sensitive then, because people don't want to lose their jobs, one. And if it's, say, abuse that is coming from a boss, so depending again on the hierarchy, and even for someone who is at a trainee stage, like an intern, then reporting could be a little difficult. So again, you talked about structures, but sometimes there is the imbalance. So it just makes it all that much harder just to report this as well.
Within the structures, there's the internal structure, and then there's also the external one. So organization also needs to have both the internal and external. Do I have an anonymous way of reporting that they won't know that FAO as an attachee or a trainee has reported, so that external also have a way of following it through without putting my name, on the map, on the radar, that I can be able to lose my job. So I hear you. Yes, people have to, fight for employment, but then your safety, at the end of the day, you can't also compromise it. So we need the internal and also external in a way that they won't ensure that it's me, or rather they're putting my face out there that I'm the one who reported so and so. And you will be surprised that the same name keeps on coming if you have anonymous reporting. So you find that if it was person X who was the perpetrator, there are so many people who are reporting about person X. It doesn't matter whether the person X is the director of the company or the founder. If the number keeps on pointing finger at him or her, then something has to be done. And that only happens when you have the external structure also that aids this anonymous reporting.
So it's just not about all the team building and what have you.
No.
There are other important parts of an organization that are just as key and just as essential.
Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned the emerging trends and gender-based violence as far as it's concerned. And you talked about digital gender-based violence. Let's a little bit talk about that.
We have cyber crimes that also has the face of women and girls, whether you're talking about bullying, whether you're talking about body shaming, people having all these accounts, pseudo accounts, to just merit violence against you. And it's all based on digital bullying and digital crime that is not really safeguarded, and a space where people don't have so much control. The privacy is also not well guarded. You don't know information that is going to go anywhere else, or what somebody can be able to use against you. So people who have really, how can I say, people who already know what is happening within the digital era and are perpetrators tend to use this, because this is a space where not so many people know. You just know that if I am in Facebook or in social media, that's okay. But how about the private settings? How about your privacy? What information is being passed? What information can be hacked? What information cannot be hacked? So it's a space where people find themselves that they are victims. They don't know how to get themselves out, because the information that is being used by the perpetrator has already reached a wide spectrum of people, and you don't know how to handle it. And it is not just the digital space. The emerging trends like climate change, it's now a big thing that is also perpetrating, that is also encouraging gender-based violence.
Right.
Whenever we have drought, whenever we have talk about livestock death, it is women who are being affected, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who have to go look for firewood. They're the ones who have to go look for water for, the domestic animals at home. Within this process, they are at risk of either being perpetrated, abused rather sexually, they're at risk of attacks, and them being seen as vulnerable and as weak vessels. They cannot even fight for themselves. So issues around climate change, issues around economic stability, instability, poverty still has the face of a woman and a child. They cannot be able to fight for themselves. Issues around global conflict that gives so many countries refugees. It's also women and children. So all these emerging trends tends to push, or rather to lean towards women and girls. So these are some of the things that are actually coming up, and organizations and even governments are trying to find out ways of preventing and also dealing with it.
Right, because again, the social media space is very dynamic. So then just guarding can be a little difficult. And then again, we know that Kenyans on Twitter are known, to have comebacks, and just you can trend. You can trend within an hour. It could be hateful.
Exactly.
So perhaps, would you then say that laws on the digital space, they need to be put in place?
They need to be put in place. But then, social media, it has, most social medias, they have their own fathers. So by the time it comes to you, a common wananchi in Kenya, there's the little you can be able to do. So I feel advocacy needs to be really strategic at the top level on how do you guard your users in all the media spaces. How can you call out a perpetrator before it brings further harm to this survivor? So yes, you're right, you can find yourself trending for all the wrong reasons until something else starts trending, is when your energy probably is going to go. Yeah, you're given a break, sort and sort. So, but advocacy need to be very high level strategically with the owners of these companies on how they're safeguarding the users, apart from that thing that normally just pops up, that don't accept the cookies or don't do this. What else can be able to, what else can be done to ensure that perpetrators are not using this space to violate people? And majority of them are women.
Right. And this has been a political year.
Yes.
And we know that in politics, again, which had previously been very male-dominated, but now more and more women. We have the highest number of governors ever since the new constitution was promulgated. But the campaign for women and men, then it's not the same. So let's a little bit talk about women in politics and just how gender-based violence, how they're in danger of gender-based violence.
Thank you for raising that question. And it stems from Beijing Platform of Action 1995, when women were not in most women were not in political and decision-making spaces. And one of the things was, they didn't have finances. Campaign needs a lot of money in terms of posters, in terms of rallying, in terms of hiring bodyguards, especially for women.
But we know the Kenya elections, it's the campaign, one of the most expensive across the world.
Exactly, because there is a lot of resources that goes in just making, even for your name to just be visibility. Because it's either you have to be trending, for all bad reasons, you have to be trending on these and these so that your name can also be visible. So with the Beijing Platform of Action, that women were not in these political spaces, organizations and states started coming up with ways of making them visible and securing their spaces. As we have the affirmative action that has been fought for a very long time. But then this was also a form of security for women even during campaigns, because we know that there is the minimum threshold that should be at the parliament, both at the Senate House and even at the, at the National Assembly. So apart from that, organization, I know UN Women was supporting women aspirants, whether you are an MCA or you want to have any national seat, any political seat. There is some funding that you are being given just to secure. And all these efforts have contributed to majority of women being in the National Assembly and even the Senator and even having 7 governors, because now there are forces, different forces rallying behind women and saying, we are here to support you. And I believe in 2027, you're going to see more faces of women being, being protected and being secured, and them feeling space to give their names outside there. Right. So for this past election, I can't say it was like the other one, because many women were giving out their names. So it's very hard for you to point a finger to only one, vis-a-vis having 2 or 3 women. It's so easy for you to, direct all the negative energy around the 3. But if you're having 10, 17 of them, who will you point?
So then one way to deal with it is for women to put themselves out there.
Put your name out
and
there.
Go for those positions as well.
Yeah, there's power in numbers. When you have numbers, then your security is also not quote-unquote guaranteed, but the level of risk also becomes low, because risk is spread. Vis-a-vis only having one, so it's easy for this person to be targeted. It's easy for this person to be violated. But when you have many, then they know there is a number. People are watching, people are following. So yeah, women need to put their name out there.
Right. And now let's shift gears and talk about gender-based violence in relation to the HIV and AIDS infections. Because we know that then part of the violence is sexual. Yeah. And so with sexual violence, then the risk of HIV and AIDS is high as well. So according to the cases that we've had this year, then statistics, where do they place the number of newer HIV infections?
We can report that the new infection rates have also gone down, because also the level of awareness. Women right now know how to protect themselves. The conversation that we used to have back then is that even when it comes to issues of sex or even sexual violence, women could not be able to negotiate for safe sex, because they believe it is the man who is probably supposed to carry safety in terms of condom or something like that. They could not be able to negotiate for that, because they've been told that it's a man's space to do this and a man's space to do that. It narrows down to also emotional, violence, that the space of a woman is just to be told things to do. But women are now more woke. They can be able to negotiate for safer sex. They can be able to say no. They can be able to have a female company in terms of when they're going to visit partners or things like that. And they can be able to sense when they're also in danger. So there are a number of programs that have been given to women, both in urban and rural area, to ensure that, one, they are aware of their spaces, what is happening. So this awareness, for lack of better term, has reduced the rate of infection, especially in terms when you're talking about GBV space. Because once a woman is woke about her body, about her decision, her principles, then she can be able to say no. It brings me further, now we will even start talking about sexual reproductive health. It brings me further to even know how somebody is affected. They can be able to know, because now you can be able to, you don't feel ashamed to see somebody's probably nakedness or your nakedness. You can be able to see if he's affected or he's not affected.
Right. Of course. And it goes a long way into just addressing gender-based violence, but also something that is significant as well, looking at the Kenya Certificate of Primary Education, the examinations that were completed last week. The number of pregnancy cases that were reported, and these were children somewhere between, say, 12 and 14 years, and especially in Narok County, which were very alarming. So this is violence in itself, because these are underaged girls. So what would you say is lacking in those communities?
Number one is us not calling a spade a spade. Just like you've said, you've used a very good term. That's violence. If you see a teenager pregnant and probably they're married, that's defilement.
Right.
Kenyan Constitution, any person who has not attained their 18th birthday cannot consent for sex. So any pregnancy that comes out of that is considered as defilement, because this person was not or could not be able to consent. But we have communities where this is happening and it's considered normal just because it's happening. But the way we report matters. It should not just be called teenage pregnancy. For me, it should be defilement. Those are, if we have 18 teenagers who are pregnant, those are 18 defilement cases. So if we start calling it by name,
those are 18 perpetrators.
Yes, those are 18 defilement cases. And some cases, it's amongst teen. They've defiled each other, because we also had cases around 16-year-old and 17-year-old. They're all children.
Right.
Those are defilement cases, and they should be treated as such, not just common development words that you normally say. Those are 18 teenage pregnancies. Those are defilement cases. So the challenge is, one, in calling it the way it is in terms of reporting. Number two, also normalizing it. Again, majority of these communities, Narok is also one of the counties that is having FGM. And as I said, it's a transition. Now you're considered as an adult. So if you are having communities who are considering such things as a transition into adulthood, then you will continue having a problem, because they will see them as adults. So their right to be pregnant, which is not the case.
Right.
So some of these things are also graved in community and social beliefs. So one is reporting. Two, considering them as normal cases. It's
normalizing
okay.
them.
Normalizing them and not speaking about it. Number three, apart from just normalizing, it's still around the structures of patriarchy. If we can have a way of having male and boys allies who can be able to stand up and say, this is wrong, then I think we can move milestone with GBV cases.
So then we need to bring men into the conversation.
Men need to be on board. Men need to be on board. Just the way women are on board, men need to be on board. And why do they need to be on board? Because number one, there are a majority in terms of policy makers and policy implementers at the National Assembly, at the Senate, political and decision making. At the household level, a man's voice is a man's voice. So they need to be at the table, because they already have this patriarchal dominance. They are the decision making power. Apart from that, women tend to be very vulnerable in terms of their emotions. So it is about what they're being told, and it is the men who are saying it. For example, issue around FGM, the Morans were saying we cannot marry uncut women.
Right.
So if they stand and say we're okay marrying uncut women, then
the rest of the community will fall in place.
Because I will be secured knowing, even if I'm uncut, my place, if I want to be married, my place with a man is secured, because I will get somebody to marry me, even if I am uncut. So they need to be at the table, as partners and as allies.
Okay, and as we wind up, then let's talk about the digital space and how it has contributed to alleviating gender-based violence.
I feel one of the blessings that we've had around this fight against GBV is the digital space. It has amplified voices of the government, voices of organizations, voices of survivors. Right now, we will not be having hashtag 16 days of activism 2022 trending if it was not for digital space.
Right.
So some cases have been reported in the media, and people who need to see it in terms of policies makers have seen it and have acted. I think a few months ago, this lady that was violated around, was it Wangari Maathai Road?
Right, yes.
Somewhere. If it wasn't her story trending, then probably action will not have been taken. So I feel digital space, as much as it's also an enabler of GBV, it has really contributed in terms of having positive outcomes around fighting gender-based violence.
Right. And thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I believe it's an ongoing conversation.
Yes, it is.
And perhaps we'll have you back here just to talk more about this, maybe when the 16 days of activism come to an end. That is Faith Opio, who is a gender specialist at AMREF. And this morning we have been talking about ending violence against women within the 16 days of activism against GBV. Let's keep the conversation going across our social media platforms at Lookuptv on Facebook, Lookuptv on Twitter, and Lookuptv on our YouTube channel. I am Nancy Limmer. It's goodbye for now. I'll be handing you over back to Simba on the business front.